I sit beside the fire and think of all the things I've seen. Sorry. What I meant to say was, hello there, YouTube. It's Monday evening. Smoking my 7L George Morgan. I don't have the heart to take out my 2 new Tolkien themed pipes I purchased. Well, it won't let me. It won't stop me from talking about Tolkien. I'm smoking my Hobbit's Weed Match from Four Noggins. In my last video I said I was going to start sort of a branch out a little bit and talk about my hobby, my tabletop gaming, etc. But in order to start it properly, I'll have to start from the beginning and I think talk a little bit about where I come from in terms of fantasy, etc. Because it's all interconnected. And the obvious starting point is, of course, Tolkien. Besides my daughter, I don't remember the exact course of events, but she demanded to she asked about Lord of the Rings and she said she wanted to see the film, and I showed it to her and to my wife. We sat, the three of us watched the film. And now she's got her head full of fantasy things, orcs, dwarves, elves. And she's constantly forgetting who is who, and I'm laughing at her, and at the same time I'm constantly reminding myself that at one point when I was reading Lord of the Rings for the first time, I thought Aragorn was a hobbit. And here's how that happened. It's very weird, how you got the most unlikely people influencing your life so much. So I believe it was the early 90s. I was still at school, and like many kids in the city at that time, in the summer we had summer holidays, long holidays, and like many kids of my age, I spent it with my grandmother at our dacha, as it's called in Russia. So it's a small land plot that was at a certain point, I think it was given to people, and then you could buy it reasonably cheap. It's 2 hours by train from Moscow, in the middle of nowhere. But for Russian people, it was, for the first time in a long, long time, they had, some land they could tend to. My grandmother and my grandfather had this small patch of land. We built a house, and that's where I spent the majority of my summer. The biggest, yeah. What's with my English today? Major part of my summer was spent there, and naturally, acquaintances and friendships formed at this place between kids of, roughly the same age. So we had our, sort of a company, less than 10 people, and one of them was the guy who influenced me tremendously. And it's very funny because if I met him today, I probably would have dismissed him at once, because he was kind of a jerk. He was a kid, from the sort of a rich family, and it showed. He was a bit arrogant. His future was pretty much set, and I'm sure he was set up, for life. And he was sort of a, what people today people today call, a hipster or something like that. He wanted to be, fashionable, to know everything. And because he wanted to know everything, he talked about all kinds of stuff, and among other things, he basically totally shaped, the person I am today, because I've heard heavy metal for the first time in his dad's car, on his car stereo. I think it was Manowar, Wheels of Fire, from their Kings of Metal album, 1988. It was the first instance. Of course, there were other, glimpses, but that was the first one, major. And then I learned about Tolkien from him. Later on, I learned about role-playing from him. He got me acquainted with a few folks. Through him I touched sword for the first time. And at the same time, from him I learned about Warhammer fantasy battles, and all this tabletop gaming notion came to me, because that was, for me, pre-internet. There was nothing of this sort on the Russian TV at the time, so really, that jerk shaped the way I am, absolutely 100%. And for that I'm eternally grateful. I'm sure he doesn't watch it. Let's imagine he does. You're a jerk, but I owe you one. So he was, at one particular day, we were talking about different stuff, and he mentioned Lord of the Rings. I knew about The Hobbit because believe it or not, Hobbit was mentioned in one of my school textbooks. We had, the small book that had small portions of different books, so that you could, basically read them and get a taste, of different types of literature. And The Hobbit was in the 8th chapter, about this, spiders in Mirkwood. One of the more, action-packed. So I knew about The Hobbit. So when he mentioned that there is essentially a sequel, I was all ears, and immediately went to my mother and said, this is the book I want. And again, early 90s, no internet, no nothing. I dropped this idea, and that was it. And a couple of months later, I remember it very vividly. I was at my grandma's kitchen, and my mom comes home and brings me a book. And she said, I think that's the one you were talking about. Have a read. And it says Tolkien on the cover. And the cover, my lord. I'm gonna put the pipe down because I need 2 hands for that. I'm gonna show you people the lamest Tolkien cover in the history of literature. You ready? Isn't it marvelous? Well, the Hobbit itself, he's like, I'm deeply sorry. It's just... because of the bit of an ignorance on behalf of the Russian publishers at the time, there was no concept of fantasy literature. It was still a couple of years, because before that whole mass hit us, so it was all done as a fairy tale, kids children's book. See, it's very yellow because I've read it, cover to cover. I think that's some transcriptions from Khuzd-dûl, the Dwarven language, done on the old computer cards, these storage mediums. And here's another cover, and map of Hobbiton with all the names mixed up. Because this translation was the first translation of Tolkien. Well, official translation of Tolkien. It was, I love it to this day, but all the names and all the titles are wrong. Because the author, the translator, tried to make them more Russian sounding, and he basically screwed everything up. And I was very confused, because gurgles mercilessly, sorry. I was very confused because this tome contains The Two Towers and The Return of the King. It's one of the 3. So it's the third. The second one is all the appendices, and then the Fellowship of the Ring. So the appendices go before Lord of the Rings. They're supposed to go in the back. And the first tome is Silmarillion, and then The Hobbit. Nice contrast. And so I essentially started reading Lord of the Rings from the middle, which I think is pretty nice because, if you remember The Fellowship of the Ring, it's sort of a slow read, and for, a school kid that will be, I was risking, getting very bored and just dropping it. But because I started with Two Towers, I was immediately thrust in the middle of the action, all the war in Rohan. And the Orcs, second chapter. The Uruk-hai. And in this particular translation, I love it very much. Tolkien, well, he was a professor, and he was not, I think, very experienced with, how an orc is supposed to sound. And this translator does it perfectly. Because in this translation, orcs are using real swear words. They are not saying this maggots, they say those fox. And it gives it a certain weight, But I had no idea what was going on. Some of them, 3 characters are running somewhere, chasing after orcs that took the hobbits. Another guy is dead at the very first chapter. I figured quickly that Legolas is an elf and Gimli is a dwarf, but for the couple of chapters I sincerely believed that Aragorn is a hobbit, because in my opinion, at the time I thought that this was a story about hobbits. And then we have Gandalf the White, and etc., etc. So I think I read later on. My mother bought 2 other tomes, and so I was reading the Two Towers, then I think the Fellowship of the Ring, and then the Return of the King, and then I went into Silmarillion, appendices, etc. But again, if it wasn't for that jerk of a kid, I would have completely missed that. Because, let's face it, this cover is not attractive. I won't stumble upon this in the bookstore and says, yeah, that's something I want to read. Besides, I couldn't stumble upon this in the bookstore because it's weird. It's, as far as I understand, it's published in 1993 in Baku. It's in Georgia, and it's published by the company whose primary sort of office and primary registration address is in Kiev, in Ukraine. So it's a weird thing. Maybe it's even rare. I don't know. Right now I think I have like 6 different editions of Tolkien translated into Russian. They're all weird, each one in its own way. That's probably the weirdest one, and I think the most colorful one. Yeah. And then a couple of years after that, we got hit by this, tidal wave of fantasy literature, Ted Williams and Michael Moorcock and Glenn Cook. I'm a fan of Glenn Cook. The Black Company Chronicles, and God knows, all the Dragonlance series, and the Forgotten Realms, etc., etc., etc. And the other end of the spectrum, Conan the Barbarian. yeah, but that was the first thing, and I was completely floored, and I was in awe, and I was a fan from, you know, first 10 pages. I was in for the ride. Still am, you know. So this is my weird, you know, fantasy background. I regret nothing. And I'll talk in more detail about, you know, all the tabletop stuff later on. But for now, I'm 20 minutes in. I probably bored you all to death with this. So I'm gonna cut this video. Gonna practice my guitar and go to bed. Tomorrow, another day. I thank you people for dropping by. I hope it was somewhat interesting and somewhat insightful. And I wish you a very, very successful and, you know, hassle-free week. And again, I thank you for dropping by, and I'll be seeing you in another one of my videos. Thank you very much for your attention, and goodbye for now. See you people. Bye.